I see some of my students here from the fall semester. I guess you're gluttons for punishment, David. Yeah, thank you for coming. So first, I want to start off by explaining a little bit about the title. So a concise history of the conflict rather than the history of Israel-Palestine or any such kind of titles that you may run across. The reason why I say a history is because there's this old adage that everybody knows that, history is written by the winners. And, for a long time that was true. And it still remains true in many instances. But also, it's written by, especially since the 60s, it's been written by history from below, history by subaltern people, history by Marxists, by the colonizers, by the colonized. History is written by many people with many different agendas, and of course that's something to take into consideration whenever you're studying any nation or event or people, but I find that in particular it's good to remember it when you're discussing the recent history in particular of Israel and Palestine. So, let's begin. The Ottoman Empire, we're going to start here because this is the place where the Vilayet of Palestine, which is now known as Israel and Palestine, or Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, was a part of for about 400 years. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire that housed many different ethnic and religious groups. It was one of the major successes of this state that for hundreds of years, this was uninterrupted by warfare or nationalism, rallying by sects, or anything like that. In an area of this size, you can imagine how much of a struggle it was to keep, scores of different religions, scores of different ethno-linguistic groups in one cohesive empire. According to Bernard Lewis, who is a famed Middle East historian, Muslims and Christians and Jews worshipped and studied side by side the legal traditions and practices of each community, particularly in matters of personal status, like death, marriage, inheritance, were respected and enforced throughout the empire. Opportunities for advancement and prosperity were open in varying degrees to all the empire's subjects. So there seems to be this theme of cohabitation that existed in the Ottoman Empire, thereby eschewing, as we'll see, something that you probably hear a lot, which is the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has been going on for 2,000 years. That's not true. They had a conflict in the Bible and their conflict now, but there's 2,000 years in between where that wasn't the case. That's like saying, I had an argument with my neighbor in 1957, and then I had an argument with him today, and so we've always been enemies, even though you had 5,000 barbecues in between. So one of the reasons for this cohabitation in the Ottoman Empire can be found in the religion of Islam itself. We here in the West are used to seeing Islam as a fanatical faith that is often portrayed in the media that way, with red-eyed followers that are hell-bent on revenge for whatever. It's never explained what this anger is. But in fact, one of the basic tenets of Islam is that it is based on cooperation between the three Abrahamic faiths, which is, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One of the most basic principles of that faith was and is that it is the culmination and the perfection of the other two faiths. So when you hear the word Allah, it is not a separate God than the God you're used to referring to, a Judeo-Christian God. It is, in fact, the same God. It's just that Allah is the Arabic word for God. So it is important to note that unlike in Christianity and Judaism, Muslims believe that the contents of the Quran, which is their holy book, is the direct word of God. They are recitations rather than stories told hundreds of years after the fact, but they are believed by Muslims to be actual transcriptions of God's own words. According to Islam, the other two faiths had their prophets as well, Moses and Jesus among them. But in each instance, the believers, i.e. the Christians and the Jewish people, failed to adhere to the covenants that they made with God and failed to meet his or her demands, however you see God. Muslims believe that the Quran is God's last and final attempt to reach the people and say, this is the way you should be living your life. This is the way you should be treating me and worshiping me. So they see it as the perfection and the culmination of the other two predecessors. So in fact, they respect the other two religions. So in Islam, Christian and Jewish people are referred to as people of the book and are to be respected as fellow believers in God. For this reason, Jewish people fared much better in the Muslim Ottoman Empire than they did in Christian Europe, as we will soon see. However, it is important for you to remember that in the Ottoman Empire, Jewish people were not only allowed to remain close to their faith, they were given special dhimmi status, it was called, that allowed for them to build new synagogues. It allowed them to be protected by the empire, and basically they were allowed to function within their own communities, to a certain extent without being harassed. They weren't all buddy-buddy or anything. It's not all like rosy or anything like that. But certainly they were given the ability to practice their faith and function to a high degree with a lot of autonomy. Now, that's not just because I think that the fact that Islam respects the other two faiths that preceded it, that's part of the reason. But also part of the reason is because that's what allowed the Ottoman Empire to exist for 400 years. If you allow your people within the empire to function with a certain level of autonomy, they're going to be pretty happy, and they're not going to cause you any trouble. They're not going to revolt. They're going to be, satiated to some extent. So, Europe now. Jerusalem and its environs, call it what you like, is central to Judaism. The history of the faith is tied inextricably from biblical Canaan, Eretz Israel, or Palestine. Traditional Jewish yearning to return to Israel was, in a religious sense, something that was to be decided by God. Just as the exile of the Jewish people from the region some 2,000 years ago marked their wrongdoings in the eyes of God, the return to the land would mark their redemption. This is what we can call religious Zionism, this traditional yearning to return to the land of Israel. Every year, people the world over and for 2,000 years have concluded Passover Seders with the phrase, "next year in Jerusalem," because they believe that this land in question was promised to them in a covenant between God and Abraham, from whom both the Jews and Arabs believe to be descended from. Throughout the diaspora in Europe, the diaspora you can see 2,000 years ago, of course, if you're not familiar with the biblical story, I'll give it to you in very rough terms right now. Around 66 AD, the Romans took over that area and they exiled the Jews from that area, and they scattered all over the world, which ends up being now like Europe and Asia mostly. So that is how you end up, as we'll discuss later, with European Jewish people and Arab Jewish people. So this is called the diaspora. Anytime there's a people that belong to a homeland and then they were exiled and spread, that's called the diaspora. So people of African descent, often referred even now as being, they're in a diaspora from Africa because of this, as a result of the slave trade. So throughout the diaspora in Europe, Jewish people struggled with various forms of persecution. In the last half of the 19th century, just as Jews in Western Europe were experiencing a form of emancipation due to the liberal ideas of the French Revolution, Jews in Eastern Europe, mostly in Russia and Poland, were experiencing some of the most harsh forms of persecution to date. This came in the form of pogroms and were the heaviest during the 1880s and included rape, killings, assault on Jewish property, and most of it with the tacit or unspoken approval of the Russian state, of the Tsar. As a result of this, a man named Leo Pinsker was prompted to write Auto-Emancipation and was committed to the idea of Jewish people acquiring territory of their own somewhere. He was not dedicated to this place being in Palestine. Although it was the pogroms that inspired him to write this work, he argued that Jews would never receive true emancipation in Western Europe and deemed such sentiments as a mirage. Similarly, after this book was written, it inspired the creation of a group called Lovers of Zion, which also inspired the first wave of immigration, the first aliyah, it's referred to Palestine. It was mostly religious in nature, whereas Theodor Herzl, who came about 16 years later, or 15 years later, he wrote a book called The Jewish State. Now this had a much more powerful impact. His inspiration came from a situation known as the Dreyfus Affair, which was a trial that found French Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus falsely sentenced for treason by the French state. The trial brought to the surface latent anti-Semitic sentiment that had been under the surface, not disappearing even in the face of this so-called Western European emancipation. So this trial and this realization prompted Herzl to argue for the need for the Jews to have a state of their own. Now remember also that at the end of the 19th century, nationalism is sweeping Europe, that countries are forming, that these usually used to be kingdoms, right? Like Italy and France and Germany weren't always Italy and France and Germany. They were kingdoms and various different names and things. And as a result of the printing press and many other things we won't get into today, and language, people started to form nation states. And so, Herzl and others argued, well, if all these people are getting states of their own, we constitute a people with a culture and a specific language. We should also have a state. So this trial and this realization prompted Herzl to argue for the Jews to have a state of their own. And it was a nationalist call in the face of the rest of Europe forming into nation states. He argues, the Jewish question persists wherever Jews live in appreciable numbers. Wherever it does not exist, it is brought in together with Jewish immigrants. We are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. So if you want to understand the reason why Zionism, which is what this is political Zionism. So when you hear that word Zionism, it's a very murky word. For some people it has different meanings, but I'm giving you these two definitions because that's how I've come to understand it after studying it. This would be seen as political Zionism. It's the need and the argument for Jewish people to have a nation state. Doesn't matter where, right? It ended up being in Palestine, but in its roots, it was a nationalist call for a state, and for this reason. This is the reason behind it. So if you want to understand the drive of Zionism, this is pretty much it. Like, I don't know, perhaps it doesn't take a lot of imagination, but when I read this, it makes it pretty clear. It's actually quite sad, I think. So as a result of the popularity of this book, the World Zionist Organization was created and had their first meeting in Basel in 1897. It was here at this meeting that the direction of political Zionism took its final form. Prior to this meeting, Zionism had no real direction, and various locations were proffered as possible locations for the state. In fact, Western Zionist discussions of the future state varied from portions of Texas to Argentina to parts of Eastern Africa. For the Western Zionists, meaning Western European, emancipated, mostly secular Jews, including Herzl himself, this secular nationalist movement was fueled by the need for a state, no matter where. However, at this historic first meeting of the World Zionist Organization, it became very clear that for the Eastern European, generally more religious Jews, the future of the state needed to be in Palestine and nowhere else. Because the rank and file, meaning most of the people at the conference, were from Eastern Europe, Palestine was decided as the place that would be settled. So as a result, the second wave of immigration, the second Aliyah, began in 1904 and continued until the beginning of World War I. Now, for a variety of reasons, the Ottoman Empire made the fateful decision to ally itself with Germany in World War I. This was a catastrophic decision for the empire, and it caused this empire that had been successful for some 400 years, to be spliced into many different sections that were to be colonized and looked after, protected by European powers for the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. During the war in 1916, so the war happened between 1914 and 1918, so right in the middle of the war, French and British officials got together and they decided how they would like the Ottoman Empire to be sectioned off. So they were, I guess, maybe a little bit cocky or confident that they were going to win into different spheres of influence. So this is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and this is how they saw it. Let's see. Oh, you can see by the cities what's what. So you can see that Damascus is now what we think of as Syria, Beirut, and that section there is now what we think of Lebanon. The Allied condominium is Israel and Palestine. And Amman, of course, is Jordan. The direct British control is Iraq. So this Sykes-Picot Agreement is one of the backdoor deals. And the Allied condominium was meant for the Palestinian Israeli or future Israel state to become under international control. At the same time as this deal was being made, the British also made promises to Sharif Hussein of Mecca that an independent Arab state that encompassed a large majority of these areas, with the exception of modern-day Lebanon, and in exchange for the leading of a revolt against the Ottoman leadership, was to become part of an Arab state. So T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and Faisal got together and they fought the Ottomans with their Arab army. They were very successful and they captured Damascus, all with the intention and the understanding that almost this entire area, including Arabia, would become an Arab state, and it included the Allied condominium. But still, in November 1917, this same area here, I don't have my little pointer, but the Allied condominium, so far it's been promised to international parties, it's been promised to, for the British to oversee, and it's been promised to the Arabs, and then in 1917, in November, it's promised to a third party, the Zionists, in what is now known as the Balfour Declaration. So this famous letter from the Foreign Secretary of England, Lord Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, who was a prominent British Zionist, stated, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." So, even though Prince Faisal's army was successful in capturing Damascus and the British were given control of the region by the United Nations, no such cohesive Arab state was to come to play except for in the region of Saudi Arabia. So the former Ottoman Empire became several different countries under various European control. Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, which is now Jordan, fell under British control, while Lebanon and Syria fell under French control. At this time as well, as a side note, Egypt was already under occupation and had been since, I believe, 1882 by the British. While these forms of influence were called mandates and were meant as protectorates, really this control is veiled colonialism, and that put Britain and France in control of areas that were of strategic interest to them. So for the next 20 years, between the two world wars, Britain controlled the area, Palestine, as it was called then, and was in charge of immigration and all other governmental affairs. During this time, intercommunal fighting between the immigrant Jewish population, which continued to rise this whole time, and the indigenous Arab population began. So you can see this. So around 1920s, the 1920s and 30s, you can see this as the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not what you read in the New Testament. That is not the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The 1920s is. As part of their mandate to control this region, Britain was in charge of setting up functioning government, which they increasingly found difficult to do. As the Jewish immigrant population grew, their political and social infrastructure expanded, and the Arab population resisted. So the Jewish immigrant population is growing more powerful. As a result, the British are working more closely with them because they're accepting British help. And at the same time, the Arab population is growing more frustrated, and they're refusing British help because if they did that, that meant that they accepted the Balfour Declaration. So they, in their minds, they had to resist working with the British during the mandate period for that reason. So for the next 20 years, the Jewish population was able to expand successfully with the consent and assistance of the British officials there, while the Arab population struggled against the mandatory power and resisted any Zionist attempts to make land purchases. Although that is not entirely true, the Jewish National Fund was able to purchase land to a large degree from absentee landowners, people who lived, in Lebanon or places that didn't have any regional concern. So they, land would be worth maybe 500,000, and they'd be offered 7 million. So they'd be like, yeah, have it. Which meant that the people who were living on that land and had been living there some of them since time immemorial, they had 400-year-old olive trees that, had been planted there by their ancestors, were all of a sudden homeless. So, because of the intercommunal fighting, the British sent commission after commission, which all in effect stated the same thing. So all through the 20s, the British love to send commissions when everything goes wrong, right? So all through the 20s and the 30s, they did this. They sent commission after commission after commission. They all said the same thing, but they still kept sending more commissions. So basically what they all said was that the Jewish immigration to the area had to end, that it was endangering the economic and social welfare of the existing population, i.e. Arabs. And as a prominent right-wing Zionist, Vladimir Jabotinsky noted himself, "I don't know of a single example in history where a country was colonized with the courteous consent of the population." So he wasn't expecting anything different. So these commissions and their findings continued, and they culminated in 1939 in a white paper. This white paper stated that Jewish immigration be slowed down to but a trickle, and that after 5 years it be halted altogether, and that land transfers to Jewish immigrants also needed to cease entirely. So that's in 1939. So in 1944, Jewish immigration would have ended. This agreement also said that in 10 years that a state would be formed based on rep by pop, which would have meant an Arab country probably called Palestine, with about 70% Arab population, 30% Jewish population. That's what they envisioned happening in 1939. That's what this white paper stipulated. So in 1939, after this white paper, after the British had been helping the Jewish population come and settle this area, for the last 20 years, you can imagine that in 1939, this is a bit of a shock to them, right? At the very worst time. You know, in the 1930s, what the Jewish people were going through in Germany, this seemed exceptionally cruel. So this is the one place in the world that we can go, and now you're telling us we can't go there. So this British, they did this about face, like what was the reason? Why all of a sudden, right? Why all of a sudden in 1939 were the British all of a sudden changing their tune? Well, first of all, they did need this area as strategic for the Middle Eastern theater in World War II. And they knew that because they were fighting against Hitler, that the Jewish people in Palestine had to fight with them. They were Otto on their side, right? But the Arab population needed convincing, particularly after the last 20 years of what they saw as, a major betrayal to the Arabs by the British. So they needed to regain their trust. So that has been explained as the reason. So in response to this famous white paper, David Ben-Gurion, later to become the first prime minister of Israel, famously stated that we shall fight with Great Britain in this war as if there was no white paper, and we shall fight the white paper as if there was no war. And so, indeed, they did both. During the war, Yishuv militant organizations, the Yishuv is just simply the pre-Israeli population before they were the Jewish population within Palestine before it became Israel. So they're pre-Israelis, that's what you could call the Yishuv. During the war, Yishuv militant organizations called the Irgun and the Stern Gang set about destroying Arab and British military installations, often killing civilian as well as armed combatants. Jewish forces, at the same time, fought alongside the British in the Middle Eastern theater of the war. So while it looked in 1939 that a Palestinian state with an Arab majority and a strong Jewish minority would come to fruition by 1949, this thing called the Holocaust happened and had the world feeling, understandably, an immense amount of guilt. They had, after all, stood by and watched and suspected the ethnic cleansing of European Jewry and had done nothing targeted to stop it. Many countries had halted Jewish immigration also during the 30s and the 40s and prevented people from escaping Hitler's Europe. For instance, in Canada, in June of 1939, the government refused to allow 930 Jewish refugees aboard the passenger ship MS St. Louis Refuge, and 220 of those were killed during the war. So in light of the Holocaust, the newly formed United Nations sent a special envoy to Palestine, yet another commission, to create a solution to the intercommunal fighting and to make recommendations for the future of the state. So what's going to happen with this area? So as you can see here, this is what the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended, UNSCOP, and it was sanctioned by the Yishuv, and it was rejected by the Arabs. So perhaps you can see why. We're looking at about a 70% Arab, 30% Jewish population, and it's a very mishmash way of carving out a state, or two states, right? It's like you're constantly going to need a passport to drive. It's a very small area, It doesn't take long to get from the top to the bottom and to side. So even to go to work, So the Arab Committee issued a statement after this proposal that stated the following, and you could actually see this as kind of being the crux of the Arab side of the argument. And this was issued in 1949. Palestine constitutes an important part of the Arab world, and that the rights of the Palestinian Arabs cannot be touched without prejudice to peace and stability in the Arab world. The committee also declares that it is second to none in regretting the woes that have been inflicted upon the Jews of Europe by European dictatorial states. But the question of these Jews should not be confused with Zionism, for there can be no greater injustice and aggression than solving the problems of the Jews of Europe by another injustice, that is, by inflicting injustice on the Palestinian Arabs of various religious denominations. So with the Arab rejection of the UNSCOP proposal, as we just heard, the intercommunal fighting between the Arab and Jewish populations escalated into full warfare. And over the course of the fighting for the next 2 years, the Palestinian refugee crisis was born. Notice here the new boundaries and how they differ from what was offered in the UNSCOP proposal. This is the area as it was decided after the war. Whoops. So here you can see the Israeli state is everything in orange, and this is what it ended up being. So these darker areas here are the areas that the state of Israel took after the war, the 1948 war. How and why the Palestinians left during the fighting of the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948 is a majorly contested issue within Israeli and Middle Eastern history. Traditional Israeli scholars claim that Ben-Gurion and the newly formed Israeli government pleaded with the Arabs to stay and work with them. For those of you who have seen the film Exodus, you will recognize that this is a mainstay of the film's propaganda. Traditional scholarship has argued since Israel's inception that the Arabs left wholly on their volition with no intent of returning. However, in the early 1980s, a new brand of scholar came to be in Israel, and these guys have been dubbed the new historians, and working with then, in the 1980s, brand newly released documentation about the 48 war, they started to make new claims that are based on what I believe, and the field itself has come to realize as common sense, that the very opposite of this traditional view is true. During the early stages of the intercommunal fighting in 1947, many Arabs left because they wanted to secure their wealth, their well-being, and because they were naturally nervous. This happens in war all the time. However, as Benny Morris has argued effectively, new evidence shows that there were military objectives in place, like Plan D, which ordered, very explicitly, evacuations of entire Arab villages through forced expulsion. In addition, there were atrocities being committed by the Irgun and the Stern Gang, so not necessarily sanctioned by the new Israeli state, which instilled terror in the Arab population. For example, at a village near Jerusalem called Der Yassin, some 250 men, women, and children were slaughtered by the Stern Gang, and their bodies were stuffed down wells. These killings and the disposal of the bodies became a staple of Irgun and Haganah propaganda, and it was proclaimed over mobile loudspeaker units that were beamed into Arab sections of major cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv. Arab radio also publicized the event. So it wasn't just the event that itself, it was that it was used as a terror mechanism for people to leave, to scare people into leaving, and it was very effective. There's been many documentaries about this. So all of this combined caused the exodus of over 700,000 refugees to scatter all over the neighboring countries, causing a diaspora, most notably in Lebanon and Jordan, and into the West Bank and Gaza. Many of their homes and shops and businesses in Israel were either destroyed or were quickly inhabited by Jewish Israelis by order and sanction of the state, and they remain there. As a matter of fact, when I was in Israel, my Israeli friend, took me around to different formerly Arab, mansions, beautiful neighborhoods, and she says, oh yeah, my friends live in many of these houses, and they live in daily fear that someone's going to come knocking on the door going, this is my house. You've been living in my house for 50 years, right? In fact, a series of land acquisition laws and bylaws were passed with the creation of the state in May 1948 that allowed for the dispensation of these homes and businesses to be given to the massive influx of new Jewish immigrants, which in fact solved the great problem that would have faced the country's fledgling new administration. So the next most significant change in the conflict, so yes, there was fighting in 1952, 1956, and there continued to be skirmishes, existed or happened with the June War of 1967. This is where we have another border change. This war lasted only 6 days and was fought between the Israeli army and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, with other Arab nations contributing troops. As a result of this conflict, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it remains in control of these regions to the present. As a result of this occupation, the United Nations responded by passing Resolution 242, which you'll hear often referred to if you're in discussions about this conflict, which states, "The fulfillment of Charter principles requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, which should include withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict." So, what's called the West Bank and Gaza, which I'm sure you've heard of, is currently and has been since 1967 under occupation by Israeli armed forces and is continually settled there illegally by international law, some of the settlements illegal by Israeli law, and some sanctioned by the Israeli state in these areas where they have an indigenous Palestinian population. So for the last 40 years, the situation in these occupied areas, as well as the situation in the refugee camps and in Israel, has changed quite a bit. But geopolitically, the situation, for the most part, has remained unchanged. The borders remain the same, and many of the same Palestinians remain in the same refugee camps, some of whom still have the keys to their homes in Israel that are now occupied by Israelis, as I said earlier. Israeli and Palestinian leaders have gone to the peace table many times, but for the most part, nothing of significance has changed in the direction of peace. In fact, as settlements grow in the West Bank, now numbering over 300,000 settlers, and with the construction of the wall, things grow increasingly worse for the Palestinians, who have now endured a 40-year occupation, which has included house demolitions, daily humiliations, and loss of land. For Israel, this means that their security will continue to be threatened as the Palestinians try to change their situation through resistance, which in some cases is nonviolent, as in, peace demonstrations, or violent in the case of mortar attacks or suicide bombers, as we are all fully aware of, because it is in the news a lot. So, I'm going to show you a video clip right now, which will demonstrate but a smattering of the reality of what this occupation looks like. And it is full of images that are not readily shown in the American media, which is why I'm showing it to you today. I just want to give you some idea. I'm very aware, after studying this subject for a long time, over 6 years now, I'm very aware of I have an idea of what the whole picture looks like. I certainly strive for that. And what the American media shows, what the European media shows, and what the Arab media shows. And in fact, when I was teaching in Bethlehem to Palestinian students, we would analyze the media, like as something. There's generally, often, unfortunately, skirmishes on the Temple Mount or the Haram al-Sharif, the golden orb, in Jerusalem. So it's a flashpoint, they call it, in the conflict. And while I was there, there was a skirmish there. So what we did is we took a look at these different media sources and we analyzed it, and they're definitely different. And they're the way they approach it, what information they include, how they include it, and really, when you look at it, no one is kind of better than the other. You just if you really want to get as comprehensive a view of this conflict as possible, it's just best to look at as many different perspectives as you can. So if that means you read every day Haaretz, BBC, Guardian, watch CNN, and read Al Jazeera or one of the Palestinian online news sources, but then at least you know that you've covered your bases as well as you can. So I have to warn you, though, that there's very violent images in here. So for anybody who doesn't, has a hard time stomaching such things, then I would, suggest that maybe you leave the room momentarily. It's about an 8-minute clip, but in some ways it can just tell you things better than I can. So.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict dominates American news coverage of international issues. Given that news coverage is Americans' main source of information on the conflict, it becomes important to examine the stories the news media are telling us and to ask the question, does the news coverage reflect the reality on the ground?
Gun battles rage tonight in some of the heaviest
a battle for survival
for Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat.
The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are under a military occupation. It's the longest military occupation in modern history. It's entering its 35th year. It's a harsh and brutal military occupation. And it's extremely violent, all the time. Life is being made unlivable for the population.
We have what is now quite an oppressive regime in the occupied territories, where Israelis are lording it over Palestinians, usurping their territory, demolishing their homes, exerting a very severe form of military rule in order to remain there. And on the other hand, Palestinians are lashing back, trying to throw off the yoke of oppression of the Israelis.
I spent a day traveling around Gaza with a man named Jabra Washa, who's from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and he described the situation as complete economic and social suffocation. There's no economy. The unemployment is over 60% now. Crops can't move. Thousands and thousands of acres of orchards and low-lying crops have been bulldozed and uprooted by the Israeli military. There are checkpoints everywhere. Palestinians can't get from one place to another. Drives that ordinarily would take 10 minutes now take 4 hours.
All the main access and artery roads are controlled by Israel. Anything that enters and exits the Palestinian areas is underneath their control. And so everything from getting medical help to getting education to trying to lead your daily life is at the whim of Israel.
There are hundreds of checkpoints in the West Bank. Every Palestinian has to walk through a single ride, 2-3 checkpoints. And the system of those checkpoints makes Palestinian ordinary people's life miserable.
هون رايحين على القدس بدنا نروح هنا في رام الله من وين نعدي وهي معنا اوراق شوفي هي كله من كوبات حليب كله من المستشفى ما فيش ولا حد راضي يعدينا ما بعرفش ليش ممنوع يعني احنا مش اوادم مش بشر احنا لازم ندخل.
It can even reach very immediate forms of oppression, such as not being able to leave your homes during curfew hours, as the Palestinians are forced sometimes to remain in their home day after day because the Israeli army says, we don't want you out of the house on the street. It means they can't buy food, can't send their children to school, can't walk across the street to their neighbors, can't get medical attention, can't do any of the basic things that you must leave your home to do. So that's really, that's a horrible way to live your life.
Since the Intifada #2 began, you have a much heightened level of repression. Often these towns or villages are surrounded by the Israeli army, and people aren't allowed to go out of their village to the next door. It's basically a horrendous situation. It's like living in a very big jail.
When one lives under oppression and there is no other way out, and he's being violated every day by violent means, then sometimes the only way out of that situation is through violence. Particularly if the one that is violating your rights and taking away your freedom is ruthless and uses systematic methods of violence to oppress you, like torture.
Amnesty International has regularly documented serious human rights violations by Israeli military forces in the occupied territories, including unlawful killings, torture and ill treatment of prisoners, wanton destruction of homes with residents still inside, the blocking of ambulances, denial of humanitarian assistance, and the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields, and has gone so far as to label them war crimes.
We don't see the suffering that the Palestinians are undergoing through occupation. We don't really understand how bad the occupation is for them. No empathy, no sympathy, no sight of women unable to reach a hospital to give birth and children and their babies dying at the checkpoint because they can't get through. If you don't see that, your heart doesn't skip a beat and say something's wrong with the occupation.
That's what's become so twisted, that that the dearth of reporting, the absence of images, the lack of analysis, the void of voices, of describing the experience of Palestinians under occupation is so vast that people have no idea that the occupation is going on.
All right, so that's it. I don't know if you want to start the Q&A. I'm sure, particularly after that, there will be some.